This is a picture of Harriet Tubman, and this is a photo of Rosa Parks. Both women lived in very different times, but what they did helped to change America. How did they do that? Let's find out. We'll begin the story of Harriet Tubman. Harriet was born a long time ago in Dorchester, Maryland, around the year 1820. She was born into an enslaved family. Enslaved means people who are owned by and work for another person. Enslaved people did not get paid for the work they did. Many enslaved people worked on large plantations or farms that grew sugar, tobacco, or cotton. These plantations were located in the southern states. It took lots of workers to grow and pick cotton. Enslaved people worked very long days and had little time to rest. Enslaved people never had enough food to eat. They never had nice clothes to wear, and they never knew when they would be sold to another owner and be forced to leave their family. Plantation owners bought and sold enslaved people at auctions. Living as an enslaved person was very difficult. Plantation owners in the South made lots of money because they didn't have to pay the enslaved workers. For that reason, they didn't want slavery to end. When Harriet was born, slavery had been legal in America for a long, long time. But many people believed that slavery was wrong. The states in the North began to end slavery. Most northern states made slavery illegal or against the law. Like most enslaved people, Harriet lived in a small one-room cabin with her mom, dad, and 9 brothers and sisters. Harriet and her entire family worked on a plantation. Harriet began working when she was just 6 years old. One of Harriet's first jobs was to carry heavy buckets of water to people working in the fields. It was very hard work for such a little girl. When Harriet was about 7 years old, she was sold and sent away from her family. Life was very difficult for young Harriet. She was apart from her family, and her new job was winding yarn all day long. Harriet's new owners did not treat her very well. They only gave her scraps of food to eat, and they made her sleep on the floor without a blanket. To keep warm, Harriet would bury her feet in the ashes of the fireplace. The woman Harriet worked for was never happy with the work she did around her home. So she sent Harriet to work outside setting traps for muskrats. To do the job, Harriet had to stand in a cold river all day long. It was a hard job, but she enjoyed being outside with nature. Harriet loved watching the animals and the free-flowing river. Over the next few years, Harriet was sent to different plantations where she had to do all different kinds of work. One of Harriet's jobs was taking care of the plantation owner's baby. Harriet would have to stay up all night and rock the cradle. If the baby cried, Harriet would get beaten. Anytime her owners were unhappy with her, Harriet would be punished. One day, Harriet decided to run away. She was tired of being punished. But after several days with no food to eat, she went back to her owner. After a while, Harriet was sent back to live and work with her family. Her new job was working in the fields. Though the work was hard, she enjoyed seeing the clouds in the sky and the birds fly by. She would often dream of being free. To be free, Harriet would have to run away or escape. Other enslaved people tried to escape, but it was very dangerous. There were thick woods to walk through and rivers to cross. There were also men whose job was to find runaways. Harriet began to hear stories about enslaved people escaping from the South and traveling north to freedom on the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad was not a real train, and it wasn't underground. It was a system of secret trails and hiding places enslaved people followed in order to cross into the free states up north. Harriet knew she'd have to learn how to survive in the woods. So, over time, her father taught her about the woods and swamps. He taught her which plants and berries were safe to eat and which could be used as medicines. Harriet learned that moss only grows on the north side of trees. That would help her to keep moving north towards freedom. Harriet also learned that at night, she could look up to the sky and follow the Big Dipper constellation and the bright North Star. It always pointed north. When Harriet was about 24 years old, she married John Tubman. Her new husband was not interested in going north. He didn't want to hear or talk about escaping. But Harriet knew it was right for her, so she kept her secret of being free to herself. Many people wanted to end or abolish slavery. They were known as abolitionists. One day, while working in the fields, Harriet met an abolitionist woman. She gave Harriet a piece of paper with the name and address of someone who could help her escape to the north, where she would be free. The piece of paper was Harriet's ticket to the Underground Railroad. That night, Harriet wrapped up some food and took off to find the first conductor on the Underground Railroad. Conductors were people who supplied the passengers or runaway enslaved people with things they would need for their journey north. Harriet would have to travel to several railroad stations. Stations were a series of homes, barns, and churches where enslaved people could hide. People who ran the stations were called station masters. The journey was very secret and very dangerous. Harriet would have to travel 90 miles north to the Mason-Dixon line. The Mason-Dixon line divided the North from the South. Along the way, Harriet met several station masters and conductors. They hid her, gave her food and clothing, and helped her on the dangerous journey north. It took many long days and many long nights for Harriet to reach freedom in the north. The last station master gave Harriet a piece of paper with the word Pennsylvania written on it. Harriet couldn't read, but he told her to look for a sign with the same letters written on it. When she arrived there, she would be free. Harriet took off into the woods toward Pennsylvania, but before she got there, she heard horses and dogs barking. Slave catchers were in the area. Harriet hid quietly and waited for them to leave. Soon after, she found the sign that said Pennsylvania. Harriet Tubman had made it to freedom. Harriet made a promise to herself that one day she would go back for her family, and she did. She made 19 trips back down south. She had to sneak all the way down and all the way back. Over the years, she helped over 300 enslaved people to freedom. Harriet Tubman became one of the greatest conductors of the Underground Railroad. The North and the South continued to argue about slavery. The Southern states became so angry, they decided to form their own country, the Confederate States of America. Eventually, both sides went to war. It was known as the Civil War. A civil war is a war among people who live in the same country. Harriet became a nurse, spy, and scout for the Union Army of the North. During the war, President Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. Emancipation means to set free. The Emancipation Proclamation set all enslaved people free. Harriet's dream of freedom for herself and all enslaved people became a reality after the Civil War ended in 1865. Harriet Tubman settled in Auburn, New York, where she began a home to provide health care for elderly and sick enslaved people. Harriet fought for freedom her whole life. Through courage and determination, she fought for freedom and helped to end slavery in America. Harriet Tubman died in March of 1913. In that same year, a girl was born in Tuskegee, Alabama. Her name was Rosa Louise Macaulay, the granddaughter of an enslaved person. We know her today as Rosa Parks. This is her story. Rosa was born at a time in America when slavery was illegal. But America was still a place where African American people did not have basic rights and freedom. They were discriminated against or treated unfairly. In the southern states, new laws were passed to keep blacks and whites apart. It was known as segregation. These laws were called Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow was a popular fictional character that was very insulting to black people. Jim Crow laws were made to keep black people and white people apart on trains, in restrooms, in schools, and restaurants too. Many people fought to end segregation laws, but in 1896, the Supreme Court ruled that segregation or keeping blacks and whites apart was legal. It was known as the separate but equal doctrine. Even worse than the Jim Crow laws was the violence. African Americans were always in danger, especially from groups like the Ku Klux Klan. Members of the Ku Klux Klan wore white sheets so no one would know who they were. They would scare and hurt African American families. When Rosa was young, she would sit with her grandfather at night. He would hold his gun by his side just in case he needed to defend his family from the Klan. It was a very scary time. Rosa always had a sense of what was fair and what wasn't fair. One day, a white boy threatened to beat her up, but she stood up for herself and threatened to hit him. At that time, Rosa could have gotten in trouble for standing up to a white person, but even at an early age, Rosa had the courage to defend herself. Eventually, Rosa and her family moved to Montgomery, Alabama. In Montgomery, she learned all about segregation. There, black people had to ride in the back of the bus, and she could only drink from certain water fountains labeled colored. At that same time, there were many people, both black and white, who believed that segregation laws were unfair. They fought for civil rights. Civil rights are rights that go with being a citizen, such as equal protection and respect under the law and the right to vote. It was difficult and dangerous for African American people to vote in the South. Even though it was dangerous, Rosa Parks tried several times to register to vote. At first, they made her take a test, but the registrar never told her if she passed. She took the test a second time. This time, they said she didn't pass. But Rosa didn't give up. She took the test a third time, and she finally passed. Nothing would stop Rosa from her right as a citizen to vote. One day, on the way home from registering to vote, Rosa got on a bus through the front door and paid her fare. According to the law in Montgomery, Rosa, being a black person, had to step off the bus and then re-enter the bus by the rear door. But because the back was so crowded, Rosa decided to walk through the bus to get to the back. The bus driver became angry and told her to get off and enter by the back door. Rosa refused, and the bus driver pulled on Rosa's coat sleeve, which caused her to drop her purse. Instead of bending down to pick it up, Rosa sat down in a seat reserved for white people only. The bus driver became even more angry and kicked Rosa off the bus. All of that happened in 1943. By then, Rosa belonged to the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP. Rosa had learned about the NAACP in 1932 when she married her husband, Raymond Parks. He was the first civil rights activist she had ever met. One of the goals of the NAACP was to end segregation, and things were starting to change in the country. In 1947, Jackie Robinson became the first African American to play Major League Baseball. In 1948, President Harriet S. Tubman ended segregation in the United States Armed Forces. Until then, white soldiers and black soldiers were kept apart. Then, in 1954, the Supreme Court said that the separate but equal doctrine was not legal in schools anymore. Many people believed if segregation could be outlawed in schools, it could be outlawed in other areas, on trains, restaurants, and buses too. But little did Rosa know, she would play such an important role in making that happen. On December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks was on her way home from her job at a department store. She took the same bus she always took, but she didn't realize that the driver was the same one that had kicked her off the bus years before. After paying her fare, Rosa took a seat in the middle section of the bus. That was okay as long as there weren't any white people to occupy the seats. She sat next to a black man. 2 black women were sitting across the aisle. At the next stop, some white people got on and filled up the remaining seats. But one man was left standing. The driver looked back and saw him. Nobody moved.
Let me have those seats. Y'all better make a lot on yourselves and let me have those seats.
The 2 women sitting across the aisle and the man sitting next to Rosa got up. But Rosa didn't. She was tired of giving in and being mistreated.
Are you gonna move?
No.
Then I'll have to have you arrested.
You may do that. Eventually, 2 policemen came and asked Rosa why she wouldn't get up.
Why don't you do as you're told and get up?
Why do you all push us around?
I don't know, but the law is the law, and you're under arrest.
Rosa was arrested and taken to jail. The NAACP had wanted to challenge the bus laws for many years. Now they had their opportunity. They called for all blacks in Montgomery to boycott or stop using the buses on the day of the trial to show support for Rosa. Inside the courthouse, Rosa had her trial. She was found guilty of not obeying the segregation laws. Outside, the boycott was successful. The buses were empty. That night, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a civil rights leader, held a meeting. Everyone at the meeting voted to continue the boycott if the city did not change the bus laws. The city refused to change the laws, so the boycott continued for another 13 months. Instead of riding the buses, people walked, took cabs, or shared rides. A lot of people lost their jobs, including Rosa and her husband. A while after the boycott started, the city enforced a little-known law that made boycotts illegal. So Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks were arrested. The arrest brought a lot of attention to the peaceful bus boycott. Soon, there were bus boycotts in cities throughout the South. Rosa's case went all the way to the Supreme Court. The court decided that the law for which Rosa had been arrested was unconstitutional or illegal. There could no longer be segregated buses. 9 years later, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Segregation in all public places was officially illegal everywhere in America. It was now illegal to discriminate or show prejudice against anyone because of race, color, religion, nationality, or gender. Prejudice is a negative attitude towards an entire group of people. Rosa's refusal to give up her seat on the bus had started protests throughout the country. Her courageous act of defiance helped to change America. Today, she is remembered as the mother of the modern-day civil rights movement. Harriet Tubman and Rosa Parks were two courageous women. They were two women who stood up for what they believed in, two women who fought for freedom and equality for themselves and others. Today, they are symbols of freedom for people all over the world.